Valerie Martin, one of the most distinguished writers to have grown up in New Orleans, explains her work as a reaction to the city's ambiance. Flaubert's Madame Bovary, a cautionary tale about a foolish woman whose romantic education ill-fits her for her very ordinary life, was perhaps the most important influence, she has said, of how she came to write. As a New Orleanian, I was naturally drawn to all things romantic, spooky, and Gothic. But in reading Flaubert, and later Albert Camus, and American realists like Stephen Crane, I felt a strong attraction to realism, both as a method and as a worldview. I didn't want to wind up like Emma Bovary. To escape that fate, she became a novelist and, as she has put it, set out on my quest to de-romanticize the world in my fiction. Though born in Missouri, Valerie Martin was raised and educated in New Orleans. Having earned a BA from the University of New Orleans in 1970, she enrolled in the graduate writing program at the University of Massachusetts. From the awarding of her MFA in 1974 until the present, she has held a series of teaching posts at New Mexico State University, the University of New Orleans, the University of Alabama, the University of Massachusetts, and Mount Holyoke College, where she currently teaches. The author of 9 novels, 3 collections of stories, and a biography of St. Francis of Assisi, Ms. Martin was the winner of the Kafka Prize in 1990 for her novel Mary Riley, which was translated into 16 languages and became the subject of a film directed by Stephen Frears, starring Julia Roberts and John Malkovich. Her 2003 novel, Property, narrated by a woman slave owner in antebellum Louisiana, won Britain's Orange Prize, was shortlisted for France's Prix Féminin Étranger, and was included on the long list for Ireland's Impact Award. It's my pleasure to welcome the internationally acclaimed award-winning writer and my good friend, Valerie Martin, back to Loyola.
Thank you.
As suggested by the title of your first book, a powerful collection of stories called Love, you seem to have had one consuming subject over the course of your career. For example, your widely praised first novel, Set in Motion, recounts the uneasy progress of Helene Thatcher's passionate relationships with the husbands of her 2 best friends, and the gentle but passionless friendship with the drug addict to whom she always returns. And Alexandra, published just a year later, relates the melancholy tale of Claude Leday's abandonment of his life in New Orleans to follow a beautiful woman into the Bayou country, where they attend to the needs of a wealthy and pregnant friend of the woman. Is love your subject?
No.
I got more questions.
No, it's a little joke. We were talking about how J.M. could say, when interviewed, when asked questions like that, he says, no. Next question. But actually the answer to that is, I think, no. It isn't love, especially in the collection of short stories called Love, because it's a very strange definition of love. They're really stories about power relationships. The story that's called Love is about somebody who works at the welfare department, and she has power over people who come to her for food stamps, which is a job I actually held, and a kind of power that I actually was forced to experience and which I didn't enjoy. And in that story, as she's walking down the stairs, leading the person she's been interviewing and over whom she holds the power to bestow food stamps, which is really not a great deal of power. She starts to stumble, and he helps her and he saves her. He literally saves her from falling down the stairs. And what they share in that moment, when she knows she's falling and he knows he's not going to let her fall in spite of the fact that she's been trying to exercise power over him, is called love. So I don't think it's it's a definition of love that most people would be satisfied with. If that's all you get out of a relationship, it's not going to hold you together for 50 years. So I think that is a good example of how all the stories in that collection and also in Set in Motion, they're really stories about power relationships. And in all my early stories, I was quite obsessed, to my extreme dismay now, with sex. And there are just no end of just horrifically detailed sex scenes.
I'm coming to that, actually.
I mean, what was I thinking? It's really, now I would just like to have those books somehow disappeared, although there are some things about them that I sort of would still own to and that I'm not ashamed of, but for the most part, I seem to myself, when I look back at those books, very naive about everything, including the subject matter that was to become my own. The other thing about the whole romantic realist conflict That is, as a New Orleanian, being essentially a person who received a romantic education, and not just a romantic education, but a Gothic education, a preoccupation with the dark side, and going to college and being attracted to writers like Camus, who was actually a realist, and Flaubert, who I'm certain that he thought he was a realist. And he was trying to react against the notion of romantic education. It's about a woman whose education destroys her because her ideals are all romantic. That feeling, that conflict, as I began to try to write novels myself, was quite useful. But I did not write realistically. In fact, the first two books, those Stories in Love and Set in Motion, are very lyrical. Just about as far from realism as you could get. Just don't read them.
And they're for sale outside.
And they're for sale. You could try the first one and the last one. You could say, I too could make progress.
Well, considering the kind of work you were doing at the time, it may be surprising that Walker Percy was an early admirer of your work.
Isn't it a scream?
Yeah.
Of course, he's a total romantic.
Well,
He's a serious one. So he spotted me, although I was trying to imagine that I was doing something quite original and new. He spotted me as a kindred soul in the quest to look at the world with this from this very romantic perspective. I just had to talk at the Tennessee Williams Festival about his first novel, The Moviegoer. And as I was reading it, I was not liking it. I thought, this is just too much. It's very over the top about class and race, but it's also, it possesses this constant reference to the Old South and the sort of romantic ideal of the Old South. And so I was feeling that I was going to go on the panel and say mean things about Walker Percy, but then at the same time, I have recently been asked to write about my own first novel and about the experience of writing a first novel, and so I had to sit down and read the thing. Well, and as I read it, I thought, you should give Walker Percy some slack. Right? It was his first novel. And in a way, when I look at his first novel and think of my first novel, we were both quite mystified with later, I think he actually did become something of a realist. But we were both sort of stumbling into the form and trying to find a way to do it in an original way. He decided to try to make it philosophic. I thought that I was making it more, well, I don't know what I thought I was doing. It's hard to remember. What I was doing was trying to figure out if I could even write a novel. So that was my goal. Can I get to page 200? And I did.
Did he help you?
He didn't help me write the novel. He didn't read it until it was done. But he did give us a quote for the novel, which was most welcome and generous.
Remarkable for its honesty?
Remarkable for its honesty, isn't it? That was the quote.
Yeah.
And he was also very interested in the fact that the narrator had a job, because he never did really have a job. I could see that he was fascinated by that. And I did. I worked at the welfare department, and the book largely takes place at the welfare department, and some of them, maybe half of it, and some of the stories about working there were based on things that really did happen to me.
I guess we should point out that Dr. Percy did try to work, but he contracted tuberculosis when he was an intern,
right.
As 25% of all medical students did in those days.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
A quarter of every medical class was never able to practice because they had contracted tuberculosis.
Yeah.
And so, not being able to be a doctor, he decided, well, I must be a novelist then, and wrote The Moviegoer.
It turned out to be a good choice.
It wasn't bad. Talking about trying to figure out how to write a novel, even if you can write a novel. In Alexandra, you took the bold step of narrating this novel about memory and mystery from the man's point of view. Mm. And in much of your work, you've been experimenting with technical aspects of fiction. An intense meditation on the relationship of the profane to the sacred, Recent Martyr, tells the story of, as I politely put it, a highly charged erotic affair in a New Orleans beset by plague.
More sex.
The two lovers, yielding to more and more dangerous sexual play, engage in a struggle over a saintly young novice on leave from her convent. It's quite a story. I mean, not since Les Liaisons Dangereuses has there been this kind of conspiracy.
Oh, thank you. That's one of my favorite books.
Yeah, mine too. And in a display of technical virtuosity, the point of view in A Recent Martyr shifts throughout the novel from first to third person, as the scene shifts from the woman's perspective to the man's.
Right.
You seem to have a continuing ambition to explore the craft of storytelling itself.
I do, and I think in those early novels I was really interested in point of view as something that could be played with a bit. In A Recent Martyr, it was a book that, it was my third novel, I think, and the first two novels were published without difficulty. I had the same editor for both, but then he moved to another house, and I turned in A Recent Martyr, and he turned it down, saying that there was no enthusiasm in the house, which has become a really great expression to use in your own daily life. There's just no enthusiasm in the house. For that idea, I love that expression, no enthusiasm. So I didn't sell the book, and it went around to publishers for 8 solid years and was never published. And at one point, we did have an editor who said he would buy it if I would change the point of view and put it all in the first person. Because it's narrated by a woman who narrates scenes that she couldn't have seen, but we know that she heard about it. And that didn't really seem to me to be so outre. I mean, I think it's actually been done before and probably even better. But that was a real that was a real test, because I really did want to sell the novel, and I really didn't want to change the point of view. To me, that was part of the point of the novel, was that peculiar point of view. And so I did ultimately say no after some dark nights of the soul. So I guess I was committed to trying to have my own way and to tell the story in my own way. And the thing that I liked about the novel was this rather odd point of view that narrated. I liked that it was about ultimately a friendship between two women. That was important to me. I didn't think I'd seen an older woman and a younger woman. I hadn't seen that explored, I thought, that much, and as a subject it interested me. And that it is about the sacred and the profane, not new to me, with the notion that religion and sex have a lot in common. The quest of both is a kind of destruction of the ego. And so that, having been raised in Catholic schools, I knew that was the goal.
And you were writing the Constellation of Nature and other stories at that same period as A Recent Martyr, probably?
Yeah, those stories probably started a bit earlier, and I think finished after. It takes me a long time to get together a collection of stories, so I had written them over a long period of time. And those stories were originally called dead animal stories, because every story has a dead animal in it. But that title was quickly rejected.
The Great Divorce also takes up characters, a veterinarian, and the Catwoman of St. Francisville?
Yes, the Catwoman of St. Francisville.
And other characters that are inhabiting the boundary between the world of animals and the world of human beings. What do we have to learn from animals in your fiction?
I think we should learn to chill out from animals. They really feel they are clearly comfortable in nature, and we clearly are not. But it hasn't done them any good to be comfortable in nature, because they face extinction. The novel that's called A Recent Martyr, that's called The Great Divorce, came out of my feeling that when thinking about and reading articles about the wild and the disappearance of tigers and the disappearance of lions, and what the vet taught me to describe as charismatic megavertebrates, that I was sad about that, and that I didn't want to live in a world where there were no tigers or lions. But then I also read about people who did live in a world where there were tigers and lions, and I didn't want to live there either. That is, I didn't want to have one as a neighbor. And so I realized that my great affection for tigers and lions was a kind of elitism, and it was very easy for me to give money to people who might save tigers and lions, but it wasn't so good for the people who couldn't let their children outside because they would be eaten by tigers and lions. So whenever I find myself in that kind of situation where I think my own stance, though heartfelt, is actually hypocritical, I always feel like that's a good place to look for a story. So that's where that came from. And that was my favorite book as far as research was concerned, because I followed the vet at the New Orleans Zoo around for a couple months, and I got to go to otter physicals and hold the cone over the leopard while he got his implant put in, her implant. It was a birth control implant, and watch her give inoculations to camels. They really do not want to be inoculated. And it was great. I even got, at one point, I think this was one of the most exciting moments of my life. I was standing in the cage where the cats come in at night from their exhibits and they go into their cages. And to do that, they have to go down a hall, they have to pass a door with a glass window in it. And there was one particular cat who, it was a lion, every time he got to that window, he leaped at the window and roared. And so I was standing right here, the window was here, and this roared. And so I recovered from that and then went in, and all the cats were in their cages in a space no wider than this room where I was standing. The big white tiger, a couple of lions, leopards, and they're all pacing around. They're waiting for their dinners. And I was looking at the white tiger thinking, God, what a beautiful animal. And just about where that camera is from me, well, actually probably closer. And suddenly she charged the bars with a huge roar, and I just fell down. I was just, and that was when I realized I really don't want to live next door to a tiger, because I was so frightened. In fact, they asked me to go out and look at the exhibit where they spent the days, and just to see what the world looked like from the tiger point of view. And I couldn't bring myself to go because I was convinced that somebody would open the latch and let the tiger, and I'd be killed. So I never did do that bit of research. This is far from your question, which has to do with what animals have to teach us. I guess I don't know, but I've always loved animals, and I like the idea of the wild, and I had more and more of the sensation that in losing the wild, we live in a different way, and that we're no longer animals, we're something else. I guess the question that generated that book is, are we animals or are we something else? That's how I got there.
Well, speaking of the dead animal stories, I'm very proud to have published The Constellation of Nature,
You
the
did.
tribal story.
You did, no.
And the reason I did, Valerie was here at Loyola giving a talk, and afterwards I was asking about how things were, and she said, well, my novel's been rejected by every publishing house in the United States, and I can't give a story away. And I said, well, whatever story you want, I'll publish it in the New Orleans Review, and it was The Constellation of Nature.
So I gave it away.
Yeah. Well, no, I think we paid $25
You did.
in those
You paid
days.
I got a check, and it was really affirming. Thank you.
And in those days, you could buy lunch for $25. So.
Yeah, I didn't take you to lunch. I spent.
Yeah.
I owe you lunch.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. But although you never did live next door actually to a tiger, soon after that you found yourself living next door to somebody else who changed your career.
The lion.
And because she was a very good New Orleanian. Now, someone moved in next door, and as a good New Orleanian, the afternoon came, and so she got some cake and brought it next door and knocked on the door. And that piece of cake changed everything.
Well, that was Margaret Atwood, who was living in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. I taught at Tuscaloosa one year because a friend of mine divorced her husband in order to marry his best friend. So it was a really good Southern story, and his best friend had left, and so they had a position. So I went over there for a year, and at the same time, Margaret Atwood had come to be the chair. And we lived not exactly next door, but a few blocks apart, and our daughters were the same age. And I was part of the welcoming committee. In a way, I was supposed to sort of escort her around, so we got to know each other. She actually was a much better baker than I am, and in fact, it was ultimately very annoying because my daughter used to go to her house and to play with her daughter, and they didn't get along well at all. They were sort of forced together. And whenever she'd go over there, Margaret would have baked scones, or she'd have baked, biscuits or cookies or something. And when they came to my house, I bought cookies. I bought cake, and one day my daughter said to me, I was already feeling so much in the shadow of Margaret Atwood that I was actually probably a few inches shorter. She said, why don't you bake as much as Margaret? So that said it all. However, it turns out that all she can do is bake. She actually can't cook at all. Baking is her own. I can make soup. But so, in fact, we did become friends, and I was the first person to read The Handmaid's Tale because she finished writing in Tuscaloosa, and she brought me the manuscript, and I read it. And there are two versions of what happened after I read it. Her version is that I read it, and she said, well, what do you think? And I said, oh, I think there's something in it, which is just laughable, because what I really said was, I think you're going to be rich. Which was the first time I accurately predicted the future. So anyway, I read that, and then she asked to read my books. And I had, by that time, I had been rejected so often that I had 3 novels, 3 unpublished novels. Actually, 2 novels and a collection of short stories. And she took them, read them, and she said, well, I'm going to give them to my editor, who's Nan Talese, who's still my editor. And so she did. She took the novels to Nan, and she said, you should publish these books. So Nan read the books. I didn't have much hope after all that time. And then that was the year that the book festival was, the BEA, I guess, was in New Orleans. And I got what was it? It couldn't have been an email. Somehow I received a message from Nan Talese asking me to have breakfast with her the first day of the BEA, and so I was in quite a panic, heart beating rapidly, and went down there not knowing what she was going to say. I assumed that what she was going to say is that I've read the books and, I really can't help you. And I was ready to be rejected in person, which would be new, and could build character. So I was really braced, and I sat down at the breakfast table. Hello. Michael York walked by. Well, he'll always be associated in my mind with, oh, Michael, she said, and he came and spoke to us, and then he went away. And she said, I think that we should publish the novel first and the stories second. And I just have no idea what I ate. So that was the end of the long silence of not being able to publish. And after that, I published all but 2 books with her. She was at Houghton Mifflin at that time, and then she moved on to Doubleday. So yes, it was thanks to Margaret Atwood's residency in my neighborhood that I actually published all the rest of my books.
And the third unpublished book that you had at that time was Mary Riley?
The third unpublished book was a book called The Perfect Waitress, which has never been published. And it was the story of a waitress who murders the owner of Commander's Palace. And it was... I really liked that book, but it was in a contract. It was in a 3-book contract, which to me was just an amazing thing to have signed. But in the course, the first 2 books were published, and it just takes years for books to actually be published. And in the meantime, I had started another book, and that was Mary Riley. And in the meantime, my editor moved from one house to another. She went to Doubleday, and when she did, and she saw the first 50 or 60 pages of Mary Riley, she said, let's just disappear that book from the contract and put this as the 3rd book in the contract. So it got disappeared like an Argentinian, and it went into a box and it disappeared. I didn't have a copy of it. When I moved from here to Massachusetts, I lost about 60 pages of a book I had started and 2 manuscripts of books that had never been published. But my editor did have a copy of The Perfect Waitress, and every now and then over the years she said, I still have a copy. But recently I changed agents, and my agent sent me all the old papers that she had, and one of the things was a box in which, to my knowledge, was the only extant copy of The Perfect Waitress. So I opened it with trepidation. Well, my agent is a heavy smoker, and it had been in her office for 20, and it smelled like he'd opened a pack of Pall Malls. It just really smells like cigarettes. Like every time I try to read it, I have to put eye drops in before I look at it. And there it was. It exists, and I started to read it, thinking it's going to be humiliating, but it's not too bad. Some of it, it's got a flood scene in it on Jefferson Avenue, which has a scene based on a story that's a true story, but it happened to a friend of John's, which is that Jefferson Avenue has always flooded in the spring. And he'd been to a party and had a bit to drink, and he was driving down Jefferson Avenue, and he hit a submerged grocery cart. Just too perfect. And so he got out of the car, and got up on the neutral ground, and looked across the street, and there was a flood party going on a porch. And everybody said, come on up. And so he went to the party, where he stayed, and had a great time. So anyway, that's the book. That is the book that has never been published and is still in a box.
But if it is published, you'll be interviewed on the Food Network.
I will.
So-
Yeah, that's true.
A whole new line.
Yeah, there's a lot of food in that book.
Well, the book that was published in its place, Mary Riley, is a retelling of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the Robert Louis Stevenson book, but told from the point of view of a maid who you noticed lurking in the background of the story.
Right.
How did you come to write that book?
Well, I used to teach at UNO. I taught The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, which if you haven't read it recently, I can't recommend it to you strongly enough. It's a wonderful, tiny little book, written in 1895, 6, something like that. And it's formally really innovative. It has 3 sections. The first section is 2 lawyers talking as they walk past a wall. It's called The Story of a Wall. So it's quite extraordinary, just formally, and of course it's Robert Louis Stevenson, so it's, the style is just utterly charming. And it's the famous story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which everyone, everywhere in the world knows. By the time it was published, within 5 years of its being published, it had been translated and published all over the world. And Stevenson took a trip to America on a freighter, and on that freighter there were 2 sailors, one of whom was sort of tall and smart, and the other who was small and swarthy. And they were known to everybody on the crew as Jekyll and Hyde. That's how widespread it was. And I don't think there's any language where just the notion of Jekyll and Hyde, maybe not the whole novel, is not recognized. So it was really taking on something that everybody would know about. But when I taught the novel, every time I taught it, I noticed that there's almost no women in it, which is something that perhaps I feel a little irked by. Although Stevenson really didn't write women characters very often or very well. But there is, at one point, towards the end of the book, when the lawyer goes in to find out why Jekyll has not come out of his laboratory for a few days, the servants are lined up and one of the maids is weeping. The head butler says, "Stop your weeping." And I always thought, well, what is she weeping about? I mean, it can't have been great to work for somebody who had 2 personalities, one of whom is a murderer. So, and I had actually been employed by people myself who had 2 personalities, and you may have too. So I started to think about, well, why is she weeping, and who is that? And that's exactly how I got started. I began to think I wanted to write the diaries of Dr. Jekyll's housemaid, and it was an idea that immediately was contracted, and everyone was excited about it, and so I felt that I hit on something good, and that was how I wrote that book.
And the popular success of Mary Riley in the film that Stephen Frears did allowed you to spend 3 years in Italy in the mid-90s?
It wasn't that. The book did pretty well. The movie was a bomb, but I was paid very handsomely, and it put my daughter through NYU. And yeah, I guess it was actually residual stuff from that allowed me to leave, to go to Italy for 3 years. I had a job at UMass in Amherst, and I quit that job and went to Rome for 3.5 years.
And how did that extended exile from the United States affect your writing?
Well, I think it was really big. In fact, when I look at my books, I can see books pre-Italy, dopo Italy, in there. To me, there's a real separation. I think one of the things of living in Rome was just to live in a place where everything is New Orleans may have some nice old areas, but on my first trip to Rome, we were walking down the street, and there was this big mound of stuff, and I said to John, "Oh, what is that?" And he said, "Oh, it's Hadrian's tomb." And I thought, wow, that's, got to be 1,000 years old, minimum. So it was that sense of living in a place that is just so enormously full of history, and yet Romans, who certainly know their history very much, are very casual about it all. It doesn't. They've never lived anyplace else, of course. So there was that. There was the presence of art and the preoccupation with art of everyone who lives in all of Italy, and we were buying shoes one day, and the shoe salesman was talking to my daughter, who lived with us for a while. She was in college, and she said she was going to go to such and such a town. He said, well, if you go here, you should see the Etruscan works. But if you go there, it's all Renaissance. But if you come here, you went blah, blah. And I thought, he's a shoe salesman. And his knowledge of his country is where you go to see which art. Not the case in the United States, at least not in this overt way. So this preoccupation with art, I think, ultimately resulted in my thinking about what artists are, especially painters, and what they do. But the big thing that happened to me when I was in Italy had nothing to do with Italy, and that was that I read Chekhov. And I had never really read Chekhov. So here I was, I'd read the standard stories, which I wish they'd stop putting those stories.
The Lady with the Pet Dog.
The Lady with the Pet Dog and The Darling.
And The Darling.
The two weakest, dullest stories of Chekhov. And I thought that was Chekhov. But I read a collection which has The Duel in it, and it's one of my favorite stories. And suddenly I just had a revelation about character. I mean, I'm certain I had read books in which characters were powerful and willful. But there was something about reading Chekhov at that time, and I mean, you all have that experience. You just hit a writer at the right time. It just opened up a whole new world of how to create characters, of how to create stories, of how big a story could be. My stories got double the length. I started to write 30, 40, 60-page stories. And that characters, instead of being these passive people who just can't really make themselves respond, they turned into these people who bark at each other and are willful and treacherous and mean and talk about each other and think about politics and reject each other because of their philosophical or political views. And so it was all new. I felt just completely liberated by reading Chekhov at that time. And that happened in Italy.
And that led you to write a biography of St. Francis of Assisi.
In a way.
Plus an Italian Fever about Lucy Stark, an American who's visiting Italy.
Right. Yes, the two Italian books, both of which I wrote after I came home. But yeah, I was attracted to St. Francis of Assisi because he's everywhere in Italy. He's the patron saint. And the more I found out about him, the more he interested me, because he was really obsessed with something that I was becoming obsessed with, which is how much when you own something, it owns you. And his response to that was that he didn't want to own anything, including the clothes he wore. He borrowed them. And he wouldn't touch money. And he believed that Christ was a beggar, and if you wanted to be a Christian, you would be a beggar. Otherwise, why bother? So that's what he did. Well, the church couldn't tolerate 10,000 beggars. They wanted them to live in houses like brothers, and he resisted that. So his personality attracted me, and his preoccupation with property. And that was the beginning of my own preoccupation with property, which took me through several books. So I decided to write about St. Francis. And then Italian Fever was sort of relief. It's a silly romantic story about somebody who goes to Italy and gets it all wrong. I think it was sort of my apology to Italy for writing about Italy, because, of course, Italians don't want to read what Americans think about Italy. And in fact, we did not get an Italian translation.
Back when the Constellation of Nature was published, Michiko Katatani in the New York Times said this about your work, that it was characterized by a preoccupation with the dark underside of life, a taste for disturbing, even macabre imagery, and a tendency to use that imagery to delineate turning points in people's lives, the moment when innocence is replaced by an acute awareness of death and pain. And it seemed that after Italian Fever, you turned back to what she was talking about with the Orange Prize-winning novel Property.
The Dark Underside.
Which is about a slave, told by a slave-holding woman here in Louisiana, and then Trespass, the novel that followed 4 years later.
Yeah, those are all about property. But I wonder about Michiko. I mean, where does she live? The dark underside of it.
Well, she was talking about New Orleans, but yeah.
Obviously. She lives in an apartment. She never goes outside.
But it does seem that after the biography of St. Francis and Italian Fever, you turned back to...
Well, I did. Yeah, by that time we were back, and I really did start to recognize that. I think of my early books as being obsessed with the notion of power and sex, and the later ones being obsessed with the notion of power and property. Property being whether it's real estate or humans or whatever, and family. The sort of description I give of a lot of my own books and of all of 19th century fiction, or a lot of it, and a lot of 18th century fiction, is that the novels answer the question, who gets the house? And so those last few books are really dedicated to answering the question, who gets the house? And in Trespass, it's a Croatian immigrant. Trespass is really very much a sort of response to Howard's End. It's an outsider who comes in and destroys a family. She turns out to be a Croatian girl from Louisiana whose father is the Oyster King. So I came back home one more time to find an outsider. And in Property, of course, it takes place in Louisiana, and it's a story about slavery and about a woman slave owner, because I thought that the ultimate property was to own another person. Now, John wrote a story about slavery, which is
My Slave.
My Slave. And he took the topic that I spent several hundred pages on. How long was it? About
8 pages.
Yeah.
We do this. Every time we get together and we ask, what are you working on? We're working on the same thing.
We're working on the same thing. Yeah. And I didn't read his story till after I wrote mine. I thought, well, he did it on 8 pages. I mean, what? Because it really does sort of the same thing. And I remember at the beginning of it, he's talking about getting his slave, and he's saying to the readers, you know, I really want to stress to you that at this time this was all perfectly legal. It's a really great, ironic line.
Her story is longer, but it won the Orange Prize.
But it really does stress to you that at this time this was all perfectly
legal.
Perfectly legal. It is a great idea, and I think it struck us both at the same time. But yeah, so that was the sort of the ultimate notion of who gets the house. And in that book, I think the person who gets the house is Walter.
And there are 2 other books that we haven't talked about yet, The Unfinished Novel and Other Stories, and your most recent novel, The Confessions of Edward Day, both focusing on artists, writers, even actors eventually.
Yeah,
painters,
dancers, poets.
You've talked about animals, now you're talking about artists. What do these strange creatures have to teach us?
Well, artists don't have anything to teach. And I think animals have a lot to teach us. They might teach us how to live in nature and how to get over ourselves. But art, I guess I've always been interested in artists, and as a writer, I've known a lot of other writers, and certainly for some reason knew a lot of painters when I was younger, and got kind of interested in actors. And in some ways, all artists are alike, but in some ways, each of the arts requires a certain kind of specification or concentration on the part of the artist. Actors, the last book is about actors. I don't think until I started to write a book about actors, I understood what a difficult and really important art that is. I mean, we like to dismiss actors because they tend to be rather silly, narcissistic people. But when I actually watch actors working together, I rode around in buses with actors, or I went to rehearsals or tech rehearsals, where an actor has to sit in a chair for literally hours while they adjust the light, cross your legs. Somebody in the front of the audience says to somebody in the back, "Can you see up her skirt?" And she goes, to make sure, you know, because everything has to be perfect. What great artists they are. When they really start working together, all their silliness goes out the window, and they are really intent on just finding a way to make you believe that what you know is an act is not. And all artists do that. You know, painters try to make you believe that what you're looking at is actually reality, but it's paint. And you know, dancers try to make you believe that somehow a story is being told by these elaborate leapings about that people actually do this, right? And you sit there and go, "Oh, God, that's just touching." So that was, I think, what attracted me to it, is that I myself try to fool the reader and make them think, although I'm telling you that this is a lie, I want you to experience it as if it was true. That all the arts do that to some extent, and so that's why I wanted to write about it.
Well, that's a kind of overview of Valerie's work. I'm sure that you have questions, and I'd like to ask you, if you do have a question, to please come to the mic. This is going to be broadcast on the site of the Center for the Study of New Orleans, who are co-sponsoring this evening's presentation. And so we'd be grateful if you could ask your questions from that microphone to your left. Any questions?
We have excellent young writers in this room tonight. We're very happy to have them at Loyola. Do you have some advice for beginning a career? You have such a varied career that y'all have discussed tonight. Is there some advice that you would give to them?
About beginning a career?
Yes.
Don't do it. No, I wouldn't say that. A lot of people would say it's very different from it was when I started, and I certainly had ups and downs, and I think that's to be expected. I guess I think if what you're thinking about is a career, you need to at the very start begin to think of the career as something separate from your actual writing, and that what you're doing as a writer is not trying to sell stories, but actually learn how to write the best stories that you can write, and how to find what your own voice is, and what your preoccupations are, and that can really take a while. I took a watercolor course once, and the teacher said you have to paint 100 pictures, and then you can begin to develop some notion of the kinds of pictures that you can do. And I think that's true of learning to write as well. The more you write, the better you get. Nothing teaches you like writing a story. The thing I think that for many young writers is useful advice is when you've finished with something, or not finished with something, when you can't go on with something, leave it behind. Because I think that a lot of times writers get stuck they're working on an idea, they're working on a story, and they're determined to see it through, but what's keeping them from seeing it through is that they've learned something about it while writing, and they need to just move on. So it is that feeling of just getting it out, not attaching yourself to it, take the criticism for what it's worth, and just keep working. But essentially that's, the thing about publishing, about having a career, is just, this is what you do. You just knock on doors, and you just keep knocking, and eventually maybe one will open. Hey. Yeah, see, that's somebody calling to say, I love your story. Okay. But it's very difficult right now, probably even worse than ever. And it's never been good. But the whole business side of it is very separate from learning to be a good writer. I think trying to write a story that pleases everyone is just a mug's game. There's no way you're going to please everyone. So you should just try to please yourself. And it's also reading and looking at writers that you admire, and you can, a really good exercise that I did the Constellation of Nature. Those are all stories in which I was looking at a story that I admired, like Young Goodman Brown or James Joyce's The Dead, and trying to sort of rework it from my own experience and from my own point of view. Usually I was feminizing it because most of the stories I admired were written by men, so I'd stick a woman in it. That was sort of my little thing I did for a while, just stick a woman in it. And that was revelatory to me, because by trying to imitate writers I admired, I found what it was that I admired about them, which was not really the whole story, but actually the way they approached their subject matter. So that's my advice.
You've mentioned Chekhov, Hawthorne, and Joyce. Who are the other writers that you're reading today and that you'd recommend to young writers?
Well, I really admire J.M. Coetzee, the South African writer. I think
The Nobel Prize winner.
Yeah.
His first book was Waiting for the Barbarians.
Yeah, I think he's about the best writer that I know about. I mean, his book Disgrace is something. When I was writing Property, I had Disgrace next to me. And although it is a third person, when you read it, you feel like it's first person. And I just was looking at the way he puts his sentences together. I find his writing to have a quality that I describe as both hot and cold at the same time, which I admire. Some people don't like his books, but that quality of being really hot and really cold, I don't know how else to describe it. It's in the sentence structure, and so he's a writer that I really admire. And of course, Chekhov, as I said, I read again and again now. I love theater, so I think I've been learning a lot about writing fiction by just going to plays. Yeah.
What do you think of Angela Carter's work? A writer who died in 1998.
Yeah. What's that book called?
The Bloody Chamber?
The Bloody Chamber.
The Bloody Chamber, no, the stories.
Yeah, I gave that to a student recently because she was writing about this queen who was sort of a vampire. I used to really love her work, and I think it's really good for beginning writers. It's very rich and erotic and exotic, and it has a lot of velvet in it. You know, it has a lot of stained glass. You have this feeling of seeing the world through some sort of very erotic sensibility. So yeah, I think she's great. Yeah, I like her a lot. I don't read her much anymore, but I think she's, you know, when it comes to rendering a sort of visual scene that is both quite shocking, it both puts you off and pulls you in, I think she's really great.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about property, about its origins, but also about what sort of technical things were you addressing there? What sort of things were you playing with in that?
Well, it really was a challenge to me in terms of the voice. I tried several voices. I knew I wanted to write from the point of view of a woman slave owner, and I made a few stabs at the voice, and some of them sounded kind of like Jane Eyre, you know. And I read other books written about slavery. I read slave narratives. I read some 19th century books. Interestingly, I read Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, and she talks about a book called Sapphira and the Slave Girl, which I didn't know. Willa Cather, thank you. Willa Cather wrote. I hadn't read it, and that was very useful. It was useful in the sense that when I looked at it, I thought, no, I don't want to do that. It was good, but I didn't want. It wasn't that it wasn't good, but I just didn't want to do that. So I was really wondering, how am I going to get into this voice? And I knew it would be a first-person voice. And the thing about a first-person voice is, as soon as you open a book and it says I, your question is it coming in my ear? Is it coming in my eye? Is it a diary? Am I listening to someone describe what's outside? Or is it an interior monologue? Or is it a monologue being given in a closet? You know, what is it? And I think I wasn't sure when I started, and so that was the real technical question, which I woke up one morning, I had a bad dream. I woke up in a bad mood, which is unusual for me. I usually wake up in a good mood. And the first thought I had was, it never ends, which is the first sentence of the book. And I got up and wrote it down, and I had this feeling of dissatisfaction, and I thought, that's it. That's the voice. And very shortly I realized that it was in fact an interior monologue, because I wanted this picture of slavery to be really claustrophobic, because everything I read about slavery, the whole institution for everybody, white, black, in between, the world was really pressed. And it made me feel like your head was always just being pressed, so I had to find music. I always have music for a book, and I talked to John, and we found some music that sounds like a million bugs, and then metal being scratched. So I had earphones. I put this on in the morning and just, and pretty soon I'd be writing away. So my mental image of that book is that you are inside somebody's head and you can't get out, and that was my goal.
Well, maybe we should close with a question all your readers have. What's next for you?
Oh, back to the past. I'm writing about a true event, which is a 19th century ship, the Mary Celeste, which was found off the coast of the Azores in 1872, and the ship was in perfect running order. It's a very famous sea mystery. It had a lot of sails up, and there was no one on it. And they've never been able to figure out why the crew left. Why would you leave a ship that was in perfect running? And if you did leave, why wouldn't you take down the sails? Why wouldn't you lash the wheel? They don't know why they left. They know they left in a hurry. They were never seen again. The captain had a wife and daughter on board, and that was what attracted me. The other thing is that they were from a place called Marion, Massachusetts, not far from my house. So easy research. And they sailed from New York.
Look forward to that.
Yeah, it'll be years.
I'm sorry. Leo.
Hi, how are you? My name is Leopoldo Tablante. I'm from the Languages and Cultures Department here at the university. And I heard you speak about the influence of realism in your work, and I take that reference very personal, because that was my main I'm trying to be a fiction
realist?
writer as well. I don't, with this thick accent, I don't want to scare anybody. I speak in Spanish. I write in Spanish. So. But I heard this itinerary that you made in your presentation from realism to Chekhov, which is actually a little bit the same one that I've been doing during these last 15 years, and well, it's a little bit impossible that everybody's it's a little driven to that in that path, I think. But I remember after having reading Chekhov's short stories, I didn't really feel very confident with that aesthetic. It's actually not mine, and independent, regardless of the fact that I really think that there is something important in the structure of the emotional structure of the story that we have to take from there. How did you identify your own voice, and as an author, what is the process that you have to do in order to identify your own voice? I also heard that, well, you have to take a writer that you admire a lot, and there's a writer that I really want to imitate, which is a French writer called Albert Cohen, and he has a fantastic novel called La Belle du Seigneur. I don't know how to translate it. The Beautiful of the Lord, I think it is. I have always wanted to write something like that, but what was your personal process to identify what the stories that you wanted to tell?
It's a really good question, and it really is personal, and especially since, you know, as you say, you're coming from Spanish, you're attracted to a French novel. I was coming from English, I was attracted to translations, obviously, because I couldn't read French, although I did read The Stranger, actually, which was a big influence. I read that in French. It was probably the only novel I was ever able to read in French. It's very simple, so that was one of the things I admired about it. And I thought, you know, I could write very simple English. I mean, it would be easy to translate. But your question is a hard one. I think, you know, when you're reading, sometimes, some days everything I read, I think, I want to do that. I want to do that. I'll read a review of a book and think, oh, I want to do that. I just feel as if I'm Miss Will-o'-the-Wisp. And yet I do have a strong sense now, although I didn't when I first began writing, of what I'm capable of, what my voice is like. And when I talk about the conflict between realism and romanticism, I would think for you it would be realism and surrealism if you're Spanish, because surrealism seems to be just like in the blood of Spanish writing, particularly Spanish filmmaking. Yeah, that feeling a tension between those two things really has to do with the way I apprehend reality and the way I apprehend storytelling. And those are two different things. I mean, when you create fiction, it's lies. You're creating a version of reality. And if you find other writers whose version of reality attracts you, it's because they tend to see the world the way you do. And otherwise, I mean, when I read some writers, like if I read Philip Roth, I can't get to page 3. I do not see the world the way he sees it, and I find the way he sees it for some reason. He may be a good writer for all I know.
I love it.
Yeah, a lot of people love it. They just love it, you know. But I get offended, and I get on my high horse, and I just don't want to have anything to do with it. You know, and some people really can't stand Henry James. In fact, my editor can't stand Henry James, and I just can't get enough of it. So it really is taste, and I think ultimately what happens is what you're looking for as you read is your taste, and to figure out what your sensibilities are, what kinds of things you value. To say I value both romanticism and realism, you know, is to say I like two kinds of ways of apprehending and of reproducing reality. I like impressionist paintings, but sometimes I like really contemporary paintings that completely have nothing to do with a realistic view. That's good, and I might try to do one. I might try to find some synthesis between the two. I think in the last few books that I've done, I really have been trying to find to do what Flaubert did, which is synthesize and have both a romantic and a realist view kind of constantly playing back and forth against each other. But it's taken me a long time to get to that apprehension that that's what I do. Ultimately, I think you can't even think about what you do, and you just have to jump in there and try to write the best, story you can write, and hope it all comes out well. And if you admire someone, I think it's not necessarily a good thing to read them while you're trying to imitate them, because then you just feel inferior.
Imitate what you remember about them.
Yeah, it is. And that's very good. And I think if you imitate what you remember about them, then that is what appealed to you. And that's how you find your own voice.
Well, in the last story that Valerie has published, Confessions of Edward Dade, a novel about acting, Lori Weiner in the New York Times had this to say about Valerie. Martin is like a great character actor who never calls attention to the flesh and blood behind the performance. His art seems to require, or at least contain, a special kind of humility, or perhaps even a desire to sidestep the limelight. So I'm delighted that tonight we've had the chance to cast a little light, if not limelight, on the work of a great writer, Valerie Martin.
Thank you. Thank you.